Morning folks, how the devil are we? It's been a little while. I've been having a little break, but we're out this morning, early spring, and I thought I would come up. Let me just get myself sat down a second. Oh, it's lovely this morning, it's light. Sorry, it's a bit harsh on my face here. Let me just get a decent exposure. Is that better? Yeah, it's a little bit better. Yeah, this morning we're back out, re-energised, and I thought I would come and get a shot of Catbells because I haven't really shot anything half decent up here for a good 3 or 4 years, and obviously was having the gallery in the town in Keswick. Probably a good idea to get a half decent shot of what is probably the most popular walk in the area. So yeah, come up here for sunrise, early start. It's you know, it's early when you're travelling through the villages and you're seeing people coming home from the nights out. 20 to, what time was out this morning? 20 to 4 to get here for 20 to 5. About 3/4 an hour, 50-minute walk up here to get set up for a 20 to 6 sunrise. So nice and early, and yeah, what a morning. I'll just talk you through what I've been doing. Really just one shot and done here, to be perfectly honest with you, because we're in this time of year where the light's a bit harsh. You've probably only got maybe 20-30 minutes either side of sunrise to get your work done, and then it gets a bit too hazy, which we've got at the minute. But I'll show you what I've been doing anyway. So this shot we're going for, this is really the classic sort of view composition that you would take when you come up Catbells. I'm certainly not reinventing the wheel here. This is a shot that I've taken many times over the years, as I'm sure many other photographers have. Really, I've always felt Catbells is a better sunrise location. The sun is obviously coming off to your east there, and you're getting lovely side light hitting the side of what would be Skelgill Bank down here, and then a little bit later you'll get first light hitting Skiddaw, although this morning it looks a little bit hazy, so I don't think we're going to get that sort of really strong piercing light. But at the minute we've got this lovely sort of warm glowy light, which is really all I'm after here. So the composition itself, I'm shooting pretty wide for me. I've got the 14 to 30 on all the way at 14mm, which is a bit of a rarity for me, but when you've got a really big foreground like this, it's always handy to have the extra width on the 14mm lens, just to really accentuate that foreground. So we've got, as I say, we've got this lovely side light hitting the sort of foreground rocks here, lovely sort of jagged angled rocks, and then we're going for that classic sort of S-curve leading out of the left hand side of the frame, running down the slope and then on towards Skiddaw in the distance there. 3-shot bracket, no filters. I was tempted to put the polarizer on here because it's a little hazy, although to be perfectly honest with you, I actually want to keep some of that haze in the shot. I want to convey that sense of sort of warmth, which although it feels, well, it looks quite warm, it is actually a little chilly at the minute, but I'm sure it'll warm up when the sun comes up. So yeah, 3-shot bracket, f16, ISO 64. Not a lot else to say really. This is just lovely. The forecast is for the cloud to start coming in about an hour after sunrise, so as I say, this shot here is probably going to be one and done for me. I'll probably take a portrait version of it as well, just so I've got the option in post, and also, you know, you can put them on social media. But yeah, this one looks pretty good, I think. Just pleased I didn't get blocked out by any cloud, and the forecast was pretty bang on. What I should also say is that I'm going to shoot a wider shot. I think I've talked about this in the past, where there's a need to shoot panoramic images for my gallery, and that they tend to be very popular with tourists. So I'm shooting one composition here a little wider, deliberately to crop a lot of the sky out, and then it'll form more of like a 16:9 crop, maybe even a bit more than that. Compositionally, it's not quite what I would be after in terms of sort of balance, but I know from past experience that this sort of aspect ratio and this sort of perspective may be a good option to have. So while I'm here, I'm going to get this other one in the bag as well, and then I think that's me pretty much done, because what, we've been here half an hour and the light's maybe a little bit harsh now. I've had the best of it anyway. I think because this is, well, the shooting element of this video has been quite short, I think what we'll do is we'll head back to the PC, do a quick processing job on this, and then we'll get it printed and framed up, and I'll show you what it looks like when it's up on the wall in the gallery. Right, so back at the ranch, and I should say that is a Christmas tree behind you. If you're wondering why I've got a Christmas tree up in May, my son's autistic and he can be quite particular with certain things, and one of the things at the minute is not letting us take the Christmas tree down. So hence why it's still there. We are trying to get it down, but he's having none of it at the minute. So yeah, that's the reason for that. If you're wondering why you're getting a pointless tour of my kitchen here, I'm just trying out a little bit of kit that I bought a while ago. It's a cracking bit of kit. This is the Xeon Crane M3 gimbal. I bought it really with the intention of doing a bit more video around marketing the business and that sort of thing. I'll just sit you down here because it's got quite a little handy tripod. Up in it, lift you up. Come back, come back. There we go. Got you. Yeah. Yeah, cracking bit of kit. I'm gonna try and incorporate it into the vlogs a bit more as well, because obviously the footage coming off this Fuji XS10 is a lot better than the Pocket 2 that I use out in the field, although that's a much different camera and it's a lot more convenient a lot of the time. But anyway, we're going to do a quick edit on this image. It's not going to be too exhaustive. I just want to do a bit of an overview because it's a bit of an exposure blend, this one. And then we're going to print it off the big printer and get it ready for going on the gallery walls. So let's get to the PC. Okay, so we have our images here in Lightroom. Now, I mentioned out in the field that this was going to be a bracketed exposure. Normally, I'll shoot these as a set of 3, but 9 times out of 10, you only really need the 2 frames. So we've got our exposure here, which is for the sky, and then we've got a brighter exposure for the foreground. Now, one key thing I want to mention here is that whenever you're doing this kind of exposure blend with 2 frames, you don't want the 2 exposures to be too far apart. You'll notice here, if I hit the backslash key, I've actually brought down the exposure a little bit on the bright frame to make it a bit more manageable. And then the same with the dark frame, I've actually brought it up a little bit so you can see straight out the camera it's a little dark. So it's just to make the 2 images a little bit more manageable when you're putting them together. So if I highlight these 2 and then open these in Photoshop by going to open as layers. So we've got our 2 layers here in Photoshop. Now, the first thing I want to do is just make sure that they're aligned. So if I go to edit and auto align layers and okay that, just make sure there's no movement between the frames. Next thing I'm going to do is use the gradient tool and a layer mask just to bring through the brighter exposure underneath. When you've got a simple blend like this, there's not really any need to get into doing luminosity masking and stuff like that. We've got a very simple transition area between sort of darker sky and brighter foreground. So this should be fairly simple. I did actually do a video on this about a year ago, which I'll put a link to so you can see that. It's a very similar situation here in that we're shooting into the sun, although on this particular morning, I've probably got far less flare to deal with here because the light's a bit more diffused. But anyway, I'll add a layer mask to this top layer, which is our exposure for the sky. Come to the gradient tool on the left-hand side, select that. Now, if I hold the Shift key and drag down, the further I bring this line down the screen, the more, well, the softer the transition is going to be. So if I just show you what I mean, we just drag down here and release. That's now given us pretty much a perfect blend of sky and foreground here. If I just hit the backslash key, you can see the preview as to where is being masked out. So all this red area is the bit that's being revealed underneath. And then our sky area here at the top has remained untouched. If I just toggle the eye tool for the layer visibility, you can see where the sky has been brought back in there. And we've now got this perfect exposure to start with. So if I flatten the image, which brings those two layers together, I've now got this one layer to work with. Normally, with most of my processing, I'll do 95% of it in Lightroom, and then it'll only be very minor tweaks in Photoshop for very specific things. But because we've had to move into Photoshop straight off the bat here, I'll open this file to do the global editing in Camera Raw, which is basically the same thing as Lightroom anyway. So if I just duplicate that layer by hitting Control and J and then go into Filter and Camera Raw Filter, we're just going to edit this file now as if this was our starting point. Now, there's quite a lot of contrast in this file already, so I don't want to go too far with it. I'm just going to do some very basic edits to just give you a rough idea of how I arrived at the final image. The main thing I just want to do is give it a little bit of a lift. It's still looking a little flat here, given how much contrast is in the scene. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to bring the exposure up a little bit, just to brighten it up. Just about there. Now, I've just got to be aware when I'm pulling the exposure up that I don't blow the sky out too much, so I'll deal with that separately anyway. This is looking okay. If I go to the tone curve and I just bring my white point in, this is just going to give us a little bit more punch and a bit more contrast. And you can see that sky starting to get a little bit bright, but as I say, I'm going to deal with that separately. So just bring my white point in a little bit, and I'll just bring my black point in a little bit. That's just going to give us a nice little bit of contrast by setting the black and white point. You can do the same thing essentially by using the whites and black sliders here, but I often find using the tone curve, you can be a bit more targeted with your adjustment. So next thing I'm going to do is deal with this sky on its own. Now you can use this Select Sky tool as a starter. What I've been telling people on workshops since this tool came out in Lightroom is that you've just got to be a bit careful with it, because anytime you've got areas of transition like this, the mountains here, you've just got to be careful you don't pull the exposure down too far and end up with this almost cut out type effect. I'll show you what I mean by that. So if we just hit the Select Sky tool. Now it does a very good job, I must admit, this tool. I use it as a good sort of starting point to get the exposure in a sky, but I don't do everything in this tool. So I'm just going to bring the exposure down, and if you pull it down too far, you can see what I mean by that transition area. You get this cutout effect, and you know, it looks a bit garish. And also when you've got areas of extreme brightness like the sun here, you get this really harsh transition between the white of the sun and then these nice oranges in the sky, and it starts to look a bit unnatural. So all I want to do here is just bring down the highlights a little bit. So if I just bring them down probably to about there, and that's it. Next thing I'm going to do is just draw a linear gradient just over this top left-hand part of the frame. Just soften that a little bit. Bring the exposure down a hair just to rebalance it. But also I'm going to cool that area down, because that area of blue sky in the top left-hand corner is giving us a nice little bit of colour contrast there. So I'm just going to cool that down a little bit and bring the blues out a bit more. Next thing I'm going to deal with is this foreground. Now it's already looking pretty nice, but I think it could do with a little bit more of a lift. So I'm just going to draw a radial gradient around this foreground. Now, as I say, I'm doing all of this very roughly, so you'll just have to bear with me a little bit. But the main thing I want to do here is just to brighten it up. So if I just pull the whites up a little bit, you can see that that's really bringing through that light that's hitting it. Now, I don't want to go too far because you can see in the center here, it's getting a little bit hot here in this area. So I might have to just selectively darken that down a little bit. So if we go to about there, and then if I draw another radial gradient just on that little area that was getting a bit too bright, and I'll just pull the highlights down a little bit there just to get them back in control. So this is starting to look pretty good, to be honest. If I just hit the backslash key before and after, you can see there that we've just got a very nice subtle lift without overdoing it. I don't really want to affect these shadow areas too much because retaining that shadow, retaining the natural shadows in the image is giving us the depth. We don't want to pull those shadows out too much, so I'm just going to leave them alone. Really, the only thing I want to do after this point is just lift some of these bright areas that are hitting the side of Catbells, just to bring out the light a little bit more. So if I just draw a little radial gradient around the side of the mountain there, and same again, I'm just going to pull the whites up a little bit. Just going to add in a little bit of contrast, and then also just a little bit of warmth, just about there. Now, beyond this point, I don't really need to do an awful lot with this. This is 99% of the edit done. I guess the last thing I'd like to do is just to shape the light a little bit more on this foreground. So you can draw your own custom vignette by using the radial gradient. If I just draw a nice big soft gradient here, if I invert that, and because the light is coming in from the right hand side, we want to sort of direct that light a little more. So if I just shape the light in this area and then just darken off the corners a little bit, we don't want to overdo it too, just about there. That's looking pretty good. I think the only thing that needs adjusting a little bit is these areas around the sun. I think they've gotten a little dark, and I think that transition area could do with lifting a little bit. So if I go into the colour mixer, now this will be a mix of yellows and orange here, so you've just got to play around with it to get it right. But the main thing I want to do is just up the luminance of that. So if I just, yeah, you can see that it's actually the yellow that needs adjusted. So if I just pull the luminance up a little bit, that's just going to give us that nice soft transition between the sun and then the colours outside of it. I don't want it sort of like this because it starts to look a bit silly. So I'll just pull the luminance up a little bit, and probably just pull the luminance up a little bit on the orange as well. Something about there. And that's looking pretty good now. I don't really need to do an awful lot more with that. Now you can see that throughout all this, I haven't even touched saturation really, and it's only had a very subtle amount of contrast adding into it by manipulating the black and white point in the tone curve. I could come in here and, I could pump in a bit more contrast, or I could, maybe add in a bit more saturation, but you can see very quickly that it starts to look a bit garish. So I think I may add a little bit of vibrancy in, maybe only to about +10. We'll go with, about +9, that'll do. And really, I don't need to do an awful lot more with this. So at this point, I just need to get it ready for print now. So that's the next stage. Okay, so we've got our final image here in Photoshop. This is
had a few more tweaks to it, just minor things like just adjusting the colour slightly and mainly a bit of dodging and burning in the foreground just to bring it up a bit more. But the edit process that you've just seen is pretty much 98% of the edit. So we're looking at basically the same file here. In terms of getting this ready for print, you'll see a lot of people using things like paper profiles and soft proofing in Lightroom, which is something that I used to use a lot, but I've kind of moved away from it a little bit just through experience of printing more than anything else, in that I find using the soft proofing process, you can end up just doing 2 edits of the image. You know, you'll do your base edit and then you end up almost re-editing the image using the soft proofing. Now, I won't go into too much detail about soft proofing there because that's a whole video in itself, but mainly what I'm interested in here is just sharpening the image. Now, you can see if we go to image and image size, you can see that in its original state out of the camera at 45 megapixels, it's given us a width of 27 inches by 18, which is more than big enough for an A2 print, which is what we're going to do here. So we don't really need to do any resizing here. The main thing here is sharpening. A lot of people won't be aware that when you're printing, you actually almost need to over sharpen. Now, it can look a bit garish on the screen. You've just got to take that with a pinch of salt and understand that that's not going to come out in the final print. So when I sharpen this, it will look a bit aggressive and you will see a little bit of haloing, especially around some of the mountain top edges, which obviously if you were putting that on social media and your website and stuff like that, you don't really want to do. So in this case, I'm going to end up with 2 files. I'm going to have one, which is my sort of edited file, and then I'm going to have a second one, which is specifically sharpened for print. So if we go to the filter menu and go to sharpen and unsharp mask, this is my preferred method for output sharpening. There's a million different ways you can do this. In the past, I've used plugins like the Nik software. You can also do Smart Sharpen, or you can just do the sharpening in Lightroom. I find the unsharp mask in here a pretty good balance for what I'm after. Now, you can see at 200% and a radius of 2 pixels, that's quite aggressive. You can see on the screen, I don't know if this is coming through in the screen recording, but it looks very crisp, almost too crisp. Now, I wouldn't want to put this on social media in this state, but I know from experience that this is about the right balance for the actual print, because when you print it out, you're losing a little bit of resolution and sharpness anyway, so you've got to counteract that by quite aggressively sharpening the file when you send it to print. So if I just OK that, and if we go in, you can see really how sharp this is now. If I just toggle the layer visibility on and off, you can see that that's really quite aggressive. But that's going to be absolutely fine because it'll look great when it's printed up. So all I need to do now is get this sent off to the big printer, and we'll have a look at this when it's printed.
Okay, so this is our final print, and yeah, it's come out pretty well. It's looking good in print. I've chosen a semi-gloss paper because there's quite a lot of punch in this to bring out the contrast. This is printed at A2. It's sitting on the mount board currently. This will eventually be dry mounted, ready for framing and putting on the gallery wall. You can see if we go in close here, we've got all that lovely sharp detail in the foreground, mainly as a result of that bit of sharpening that we did at the end of the processing session there. So I'll get this framed up on the gallery walls, and until next time, I'll catch you on the next one.